So I'm really, really pleased to be here. It's great that you've all managed to come along. I was just reminiscing with Bruno about the time I flew all the way to Denver to give a talk that was scheduled to clash with one given by Don Box, who was the architect on COM. It was a really popular talk. Mine wasn't. There were 2 people in the room, all the way from the UK to Denver. I was psyched. Anyway, so enough about that. There's a lot more of you here, and that's great. So my name's Ade Miller. I'm actually the development manager with a group called Patterns and Practices, whom you may or may not have heard of. We do sort of things to try and make enterprise developers more successful on the Microsoft platform, like Enterprise Library and Prism and Unity and stuff like that. We'll be coming more to that a bit later. Prior to that, I was a developer and then a dev lead on Visual Studio Tools for Office. So, big, Visual Studio. Hopefully some of you are sort of vaguely familiar with what I mean when I talk about Visual Studio. It's Microsoft's IDE for developers. It's a shell, much like Eclipse is a shell that has a lot of plugins around language services, packages for doing different things, web development, Azure development, different languages. We have customers who plug in their own languages. You can get sort of languages like COBOL in Visual Studio, inside the Visual Studio, should you want COBOL inside Visual Studio. No, people do. No, really, they do. It was a huge seller. I was at a conference. Everyone was wearing these Got COBOL T-shirts. It was just the biggest thing. Oh, I'm not kidding. And that's just one part of what the division that I'm going to talk about does. They not only produce the shell, the actual development tool, they also produce the runtime and a set of additional packages called Team System, which are essentially a bunch of project management tools and source code control system that also integrates into the same shell. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. So that might lead you to ask the question, well, how big is big? Well, it turns out big is really big. When I joined Developer Division, I spent most of my professional career at really small companies. I turned up at new employee orientation on the first day, and there were more people at that than had been employed at all the companies I'd worked for in the past 3 or 4 years. And the complexity just rises astronomically. I would show up and I'd be sitting there trying to play with this code, trying to fix stuff. And as a developer prior to that, I'd taken a bunch of things that Microsoft had given me as sort of givens. So if my code didn't work, I didn't assume there was a bug in the CLR. Well, working in DevDiv, that's a really poor assumption because you're working on a version of the CLR that was built last week. There's no guarantee that they were actually kind of done with it. So it's a pretty challenging environment. And as you can see, there's 3,500 people checking into this code base pretty much on a weekly basis. There's an insane number of source code files, 23 million. That, I suspect, includes not just the actual production code. It includes all the test code, a whole bunch of other files that we have to track stuff, data files, you name it. But there's a lot of stuff there moving around, and apparently it's 15 terabytes of data by the time you've included all the versioning stuff. So, why change a good thing? Well, it turns out there were a bunch of reasons to go change a good thing. If you look at that graph over there, you'll see there's a red line on it. I joined the division at the top of that red line and spent 18 months fixing bugs in 2005. And I wasn't so wild about that. And that really is what got me started on thinking of some better ways to help the product unit I was part of at the time do better. So there's a bunch of things I'm going to talk about here. They're not in order. But they're not in priority order. Let's put it this way. I don't want you to think that Microsoft and my team thought that delivering what users wanted was the 4th priority, but it just makes the story a little bit easier to tell. And there's this whole be more agile thing, and that's sort of in quotes because you hear lots of sort of senior executives say be more agile, and that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So really, how do we think about some of these things? And really, there's a challenge here around just driving quality on a really large team, right? You've got all these people doing all these different things. There are all these moving parts. And really, the key to that was isolation and trying to make sure that we only got finished things into the product. You know, in previous versions of Visual Studio, we'd had lots and lots of people all committing into the same parts of the source tree, and it leads to a lot of problems, right? You end up with a source tree that isn't really in any sort of known state. And over several releases, the division had sort of moved away and tried to compartmentalize its how it did development further. And this sort of talk explains how they kind of took that to its next logical step. So has anyone here heard of this thing called the feature cruise model? A couple of people. Okay, so feature cruise was something that came out of Office. But really the idea of feature cruise is to break the product down into small compartmentalized features that a small group, a manageable group of people can work on. So typically you think about a feature being worked on by about a dozen people over a period of sort of 4 or 5 months. And they might have broken it down further in during that period. Really, you can think about a feature, and if you went back and you read the original document that was circulated around the division, and I sort of remember doing this, and thinking, really, it was interesting. It didn't really talk about what the people in the feature crew did. It talked about the results of what they did. So really, it was all about compartmentalization. So, you know, if you wanted to do your insane, you know, pick one development process in this crew, no one would care, provided you met this idea of quality gates at the end. And a quality gate is really a contract between you and all your peer feature crews and peer product units within the division that says, when I give you something that I say is done, you're not going to come back to me and say, you said it was done and yet it doesn't pass this criteria. We're all going to work off a common set of criteria, which, you know, if you do Scrum, is very familiar, right? We talk about done lists all the time. Well, quality gates are a big version of a done list. And then these things only get merged in after you've actually been able to check the box on all these contracts. Of course, to do this, you actually have to understand how you're going to move the code around. And there was when you've got this many people all committing code, you can't all do it in the same place. Thousands of developers all checking into the same branch, even if they're really competent, will break the build. And if they all break the build occasionally, then the build is always broken. So the idea is you isolate all your features, and this is a really complicated diagram I scrounged from somewhere, but it sort of tries to show you how the code base is broken down. And really what happens is features are created in these grey boxes at the bottom, and then they move up the tree and then get pushed down into other people's branches. And eventually, everything ends up at the top in what's labeled dev10 main, and that's where we ship from, right? So that's the branch that everything in there should have passed the contracts, so it should be in a shippable state. It should be complete pieces of work. And that has a whole bunch of advantages if you can actually do this right. And some of them are obvious. Your build isn't broken. And some of them are slightly less obvious. Namely, if I give my community a beta, I can tell them what's in that beta. Blank stares all around. How could that not possibly be true? Well, if I've got a whole bunch of people checking into one branch and I'm trying to build out of it, how do I know what's done and what's not? And you can get into a very sort of convoluted situation where you're not really quite sure what you've got to give someone, and then they waste time and get frustrated looking at something, and you turn around and go, well, yeah, it didn't really work anyway, sorry. Not a good story. So the idea is you merge all this stuff up and down the tree really frequently, and you're typically building in all these main branches nightly. So Microsoft has a long history of doing continuous integration. There are nightly builds all over this tree. To integrate stuff up and down, you have to pass gates, which means you have to have merged your changes and passed lots of tests. We actually, the product group I was in actually had a dedicated engineer for doing a lot of that. So now you've got a whole bunch of people and they're trying to, they're doing their own thing within these feature branches, and they have their own branches for code, and they're moving code up and down. That's all very well, but how do you trust them, right? You've got all these people and they're doing all these things. So how do you actually, so the idea is, well, you trust everyone, but how do you verify? How does senior management know that the right things are going on? So inevitably you have to have some sort of reporting structure, and the sort of reporting structure that you or I might have on our small 12-person Scrum team isn't going to work for the vice president of DevDiv, because they're not going to come around to all our team rooms to look at burn down charts. That would be a scary thought, wouldn't it? So what they really did was they said everyone has to use a common reporting structure across the different product units and different features. So you can work in your own way, provided you pass the quality gates, but you've got to give us some data on a regular basis that tells us how far along you think you are. And there's a bunch of good reasons for doing that, right? You want to be able to load balance between different feature crews within a product unit. You might want to know whether one particular part of your product is coming in hot. Is it at risk? So there was this idea of essentially a common release tracking structure. So the idea is that you can do what you want. I've got a team here doing some form of modified Agile. Goodness knows what they're doing. I've got a team that thinks it's doing Scrum. I've got another team doing Scrum and XP. But they're all providing the same weekly status roll-up. They're all doing the same sort of 5-week iterations. So there's a regular cadence across the whole division of these sort of mini reporting cycles. Within the product unit, there's another cadence. So we're doing demos. We're showing completed work at the end of each one of these iterations. We're trying to push stuff up the tree when we're done with it. But the important thing is to have some sort of form of commonality there. And this is something that we use Visual Studio Team System to do. These are all reports from VSTS. You'll be pleased to know that the red and green one at the bottom was affectionately called the Christmas tree chart. That was because it was red and green, not because we thought we weren't going to ship till Christmas. And there's a couple of levels of this. So there's a level at the product unit level. So that's the sort of large team size, sort of 70+ people. And then there's a further roll up at the kind of overall business level. So you've got 2 tiers here. Because essentially the division is broken down into product units. So C# would be a product unit. Visual Studio Tools for Office is a product unit. Visual Basic would be another product unit. And then below that, you've got these crews working on different features. And these are some of the sort of graphs you can produce. You can produce cumulative flow diagrams. You can have defect graphs, that sort of thing. But you really can't run a project this big without that sort of reporting. So that's all very well, but not if at the end of the day you produce something that users didn't want in the first place. So how do you sort of tackle that problem? It actually turns out to be quite difficult. You have to be able to break things down in such a way that the group of people at the bottom who are building an individual feature don't have to worry about the whole product in order to do this. And especially my finding on sort of agile teams is agile teams tend to be really focused on what you told them to be focused on, right? And they're not so good at sort of, saying, oh, I don't think I'll play with that today. I think I'll go look at some completely other, random thing that's maybe might affect me in the future. They tend to kind of be down in the trenches working on what you ask them to deliver on. The problem with that is, well, who's going to do that work? Who's actually going to sort of figure out what's going on? Do all these individual pieces fit together in a way that end users aren't going to just sit there going, what do I do with this, right? And you've actually potentially exacerbated that problem because you've broken this thing up into pieces. It's possible to produce pieces that don't necessarily fit at the end of the day, right? especially when you're producing them in different source code branches, so you can't even necessarily plug them together on any given day. You can only plug them together when they merge up and down the tree. And as you'll see, that was one of the things that we kind of struggled with. So the solution is really this tiered approach. So the actual whole product, there was sort of these core value propositions that were, there's the actual scenario, there's some value propositions, then there's some experiences, and then those are broken down into features. And essentially the visibility goes back up the tree. And the way that worked, obviously that worked slightly differently in different product units, but the way it worked in our product unit, for instance, was that the feature crew, the team that actually owned, say, the Office ribbon designer was one of the, the Office has that nice ribbon. Well, we built a tool that let developers design their own ribbons. That had a crew working on it. The issue with that was, well, what happens if they want to change that? And the way it really worked was the crew could make minor changes to that just on their own, right? They could decide, well, this isn't going to work. We're going to tweak this for some, technical reasons, say. But if they wanted to make a large change that affected the experience, suppose they decided they didn't have time to do something, or something was too hard, or they'd had user feedback that something just wasn't what was required. If they wanted to cut that, they kind of had to get buy-off from the product unit level. So they had to go one level up that tree. Because obviously the lady who ran our product unit was kind of too busy to actually be running around actually sitting with 7 different feature crews on any given week. You've only got to do the meeting math to realize that that's not going to work for her. So really there was a sort of a delegation and this tiered approach. There are some constraints with that, in that other people will tell you really want to have one backlog. I've not seen that work on really, really large teams. Does that give you an idea of what the division was trying to do with the Visual Studio release? Does anyone have any sort of questions about sort of what we were trying to do there? Excellent question. So the question was, how did the product owners, essentially, how are we driving customer value, and how were the product owners integrated with that team, and how did we make those decisions around the business and the product? Is that about right? So what happened there was, as I said, there was sort of this tiered approach. So pretty much every one of those feature crews had someone who was tasked with being the product owner. Obviously, getting having a real customer on a team like that, when you have millions of customers, it's very hard to get someone's representative. Typically at Microsoft, there's a role called the program manager, it's an incredibly amorphous role, but essentially one of the things those people tend to do is it's their job to understand the customer as best they can. So there was one of those on every single feature crew, and then at the product unit level, one of the things that the lady who ran the product unit and her management team also focused on was they understood that at a sort of a bigger picture level. So there were, and then at the actual business unit level, so at the sort of the person who owned Visual Studio, at the start of that product, they'd come up with these things they called the pillars. And there were sort of 5 pillars of, they were called the pillars of AUKUS because that was the code name. There were 5 pillars, and they were things like Office development. So Visual Studio Tools for Office was a pillar of the 2008 release. And essentially, there was a document around this, but basically it was produce a much better experience for developers doing Office. Another pillar was there were a whole bunch of language features around data querying, a thing called Link that's built into C# and VB. And that was another one of these pillars. And really what defined the pillars were, these are the things that we absolutely have to ship in this release. We're doing a whole bunch of other stuff that we think is important, but there are these 5 core experiences, and then everything filtered down that last diagram like that. Does that give you a flavor for what we were doing? So the question was, how were the features broken up horizontally or vertically? The features were in general broken up vertically. There were some caveats to that. So for instance, and I'm only talking about the team I was on here. Obviously, different teams across the division took way different approaches. Some of them were not agile at all. Some of them did a whole bunch of different agile stuff or what have you. We typically tried to break things down vertically, so teams owned whole sort of feature areas. Both, for instance, the obvious one is design and runtime. With a product like Visual Studio, you've got a design time, and then you might have some constraints on the runtime. So typically they were broken up vertically. I think the one place we didn't do that was we had a team that just did setup, right? And they were setup and deployment, and they were separate. And actually that caused us some problems, which I'll get to in a minute. So, as I said, I was on this Visual Studio Tools for Office team. Their job was to try and make the development experience for people writing add-ins to Office a better experience in Visual Studio. It was about 75 people. We were just one of these many, many teams. I think there were about 15 different product units contributing to the code base. We basically took this approach that, we can do agile feature crews because no one's told us we can't, right? It was all about this contract, and the contract didn't say, it had some things in there that, for instance, at the end of a feature, you had to produce a design document. We said, it was a living document. We wrote a design document as we went along. I can remember having some very entertaining conversations with some of my developers I walked into this guy's office, and he said, oh yeah, I got to go finish that design document. And I said, okay. Well, and he said, I've got, and he had this whiteboarded diagram on his whiteboard, and he said, yeah, I've got to go, turn that into a Visio chart or something. And I said, don't bother. Just take a picture of it and stick it in a Word document, write some notes, and you're done. Because essentially, it's only for internal use, right? So from a customer's perspective, it's waste. If you follow the whole lean thinking thing, right? No customer's going to say, well, your product's kind of horrible, but I really love your design document. It's just not going to happen. So, so we essentially used an agile process. They sent a couple of volunteers, like me, on some Scrum training, and we ran these 7 crews for sort of essentially the bulk of the Visual Studio 2008 project. And, we made some modifications to the Scrum process, some good, some bad. And the other interesting thing we did, which the feature crew model didn't really talk about, was that we tried to keep teams together. The idea of a feature is really, you decide you've got a feature, you get a bunch of people in the same room, you have them do all this work, and then you disband them. And we basically said, that's not really a good way to build teams. It takes a team. I have friends who do coaching. They say it takes a team at least 3 months to form. If you think a feature's only going to last 2.5 to 3 months, that doesn't really work. So we actually tried to keep our teams together for the whole of the product cycle, which I'll come to in a minute. It caused some challenges, but it also had some big benefits. You saw the first graph there on the left. That was the sort of the bug, the defect rate in the previous release, the one where I spent a long time driving down that red line. Single-handed, I might add. The second graph, in theory, should be bigger because it's actually all the bugs, not just the product bugs. I won't go into the difference, but essentially there should be more of them, right? And there's a lot less. It turns out we actually ended up with a 10x debt reduction from this process, largely because we didn't let bugs get into the main branch. And there are all sorts of problems with bugs once they're in the main branch. Not only do they prevent you from shipping, but you also have to go chase them down, and that's incredibly expensive, right? Because you have to find the guy who wrote the thing. They probably have to enlist in a different place in the tree. They might have to set up a different machine. It was something they wrote 6 months ago that, They've now moved groups. They don't even care about it anymore, whatever. You know, there's a whole bunch of things where if you can get people fixing stuff the day they made the mistake, you're much better off than having them do it months later. So not only did we improve quality, but we also made fixing the defects that we did get more efficient. It also just made the whole product much more predictable in terms of when we thought we were going to deliver. The problem with the graph with the red line on it, and the reason the red line is there is because that's what predictability meant, right? You could statistically say, well, I have an incoming rate of X, and I have a fixed rate of Y, and I think I'm going to, I'm going to triage some bugs away, and I'm going to sort of futz with that a little bit. But essentially, you're basically on a glide path. That was what we had. I call it failing forwards, right? You can't do anything. I climb mountains. There you call it failing upwards, right? You've got halfway up the mountain. You can't go back down. You don't have enough rope and equipment to get back down. You're going up whether you like it or not. It's a kind of an entertaining position to be in. So we learned a bunch of lessons by this, and I want to get onto the distributed stuff, so I'm just going to go through these relatively quickly. And in fact, we'll come back to them at the end of the talk because there's some commonality between what I discovered doing distributed agile on a small team and what I understood about doing large-scale agile on a really big team. So essentially, the only reason we don't write assembler, because the computer understands assembler, right? It was dead happy with the, well, it wasn't dead happy with the assembler I wrote, but maybe it was dead happy with the assembler you wrote. Really, code is to let programmers communicate with each other. It's a way of transferring intent from you to the other people on your team. One of the problems with producing lots of branches like this is it becomes quite hard to see where all the code is and how it all fits together. So we got some pushback from quite senior people on the team, architects, very senior devs, who in previous releases, that's one of the big places they felt they added value. They would be looking at the overall code base, looking how things fitted together, looking for issues. We also saw pushback because now you've got all these different pieces of feature in different branches. You have to assemble them somewhere before customer can start to look at end-to-end stories through all these things. So there were some challenges there. And really the issue was that we weren't integrating often enough. Right, so integration turned out to be very expensive, so merging all these different branches together was very expensive, so people would defer it because they would say, well, it's going to take me several days, so I won't do it. Crews would try and delay merging, they'd try and amortize cost by doing that. Again, being able to automate it, a lot of it could have been more automatable than it was. I know they're doing some work on that for the next release. But we're just now, obviously, Visual Studio 2010 is about to ship, so people are starting to think about what, not the product per se, but the engineering of that product is going to look like in the next release. We've sort of had a rethink after each release to see, well, what could we do better next time? So that's one of the things that they're looking to do. And if you're on a sort of a smaller agile team, this sort of sounds like a no-brainer, right? You've got a CI server, you build your product, you probably deploy it all the time. There are lots of challenges around doing this on something that's this big. Just doing a full stack build of Visual Studio on a pretty large machine is a sort of 4 or 5 hour job. Just getting all the source code and physically building it, let alone running any tests or anything. That's just to get the whole a version of it up on your machine built. So that makes the sort of CI that most people do kind of challenging. We have some workarounds that for day-to-day dev work. You don't have to build the whole thing, but it's a challenge. So this was something that actually worked pretty successfully, was this idea of this common reporting structure. It certainly allowed our product unit to do some rethinking and rescheduling around how we'd allocated people across crews. We were trying to keep the crews together, so there was a conflict there between reallocating people where we needed them and having the crews kept together. But at least it gave us some visibility into what was going on there. And we had some interesting conversations around some of these sort of burn down charts and how people would come to, proposing their next iteration, and they'd say, well, I got 300 hours done in my last iteration, and this iteration, Frank's away on holiday, but we're going to get 400 hours done. And it was a way for us to have a conversation with those teams to go, hang on, how are you going to do that, right? Whereas in previous releases, there would have been no visibility into that, so there would have been no conversation. So as I said, we were running a sort of a Scrum XP type environment on 5-week iterations. We had some adoption successes, daily stand-up meetings. If there's one thing that I think I helped Microsoft do, it was understand the daily stand-up meeting. The building I used to work in had these sort of little cubicles at the end of all the corridors, which had, a couple of chairs and a whiteboard and one of those sort of opaque glass screens you can write on. And it was just this truly amazing thing. Over the space of about 2 or 3 months, I noticed that all these things had stuff scribbled on them that said, cider team, daily stand-up in here, 10 to 10:30, get out, it's ours. All these, it's a big building, 6 floors. There must have been, I don't know, a couple of dozen of these little cubicles, and they were all being used for that, which previously people had just never done. They'd never actually done that, and at Microsoft, people tend to work in separate offices, so you could quite happily go hide away, blissfully ignorant of what was going on, and that kind of made people turn up and have the conversations they should have. We had a lot of success with CI. That's something I've always been a big proponent of. We actually rolled out a CI build for every single one of the crews. Not only did that enable them to do continuous integration as they were checking code in, it also allowed them to do nightly builds for the test teams off the back of the same server, which was huge because in previous releases that could take a long time. You as a developer could be working on a code base that was days or maybe even a week out of sync with the code that someone was testing because they'd done these integrations, they created a drop from somewhere else, what have you. So now you could actually, the person testing your code could test the code that you wrote the day before. Unit testing was another thing that was huge. We basically had a mandated code coverage number that the division had set across the board. In addition to that, our team were really keen to sort of turn that dial up a little bit. The interesting thing is if you give people a metric, they will meet it regardless of whether it makes sense or not in some cases, right? So I had some, there were some interesting conversations there about getting people to understand the spirit in which the number was given as opposed to just blindly meeting the number. Namely, don't write tests that exercise the code but don't assert anything at the end, because all that really tells you is it didn't crash, right? Or don't write tests on property getters setters because that doesn't really help anyone. What number? The code. Oh, so the code coverage number was 70% for all automated tests. So that wasn't just unit tests. That was all automated tests. But our group said, essentially, we wanted to try to get to 80% just with unit testing on code coverage. That's actually pretty challenging when you're living in an environment with a really, really large monolithic legacy application like Visual Studio. And of course, we were tools for Office, so we had another really large legacy application, namely Office. So there were some challenges. Writing unit tests around Office is hard because mocking it turns out to be, if anyone's ever looked at the Office APIs, mocking the Office APIs is a challenge, right? So there were some challenges there, but by and large we hit those numbers. And then we focused on keeping teams together. There were some challenges, co-location being one of them. Microsoft has always had a culture of giving people individual offices. It's actually essentially a sign of status. They're allocated on length of tenure, basically, with a few exceptions. So getting people to give up their own offices and go and work in a team room was a challenge. Not to mention actually physically finding rooms you could use for that purpose was also difficult. Pair programming, again, that's not something that people were necessarily comfortable with. when I've talked to teams about Agile adoption, that tends to be the one that I leave till last. It seems to be a battle that would be a good one to fight if you were intent on losing the war. My current team does actually pair program, but that's another story. What I really learned from this is that large organizations take a long time to change, and I may be really risk averse, but I shouldn't expect my co-workers to be. I did mention I climb mountains, so does anyone, that sort of wraps up some of the learnings that we had from the Visual Studio thing. Does anyone have any sort of questions about that before I move on? Oh, okay. There's a gentleman at the front here. The question was, what was most responsible for the 10x reduction in debt? I think it was having these quality gates in place that really disincentivized teams from pushing code up the tree that was not done. Right? So we stopped the bugs getting in there, early rather than later. The question was what were the quality gates? But typically they were things like code coverage metrics, security, static analysis. There were some paperwork steps. So do you have a design document? Have you passed localization testing? There was I think it was about a dozen of them in the end. So, good question. The question is, how were those 5-week iterations aligned? And the answer was they were all in lockstep. And yes, that did give us integration problems. But remember, the tree is tiered. So I only have integration problems up one level of the tree at any one time. Right? But yes, that did give us issues. We actually, why are we doing 5-week iterations? Where did we come up with that number from? And I've spoken to other groups who were also doing Scrum within the division, and they were sort of, well, why do we pick 5-week iterations? But the reality of it is, the thought of trying to educate everyone around having 2 different iteration cadences, one for the overall product and one for your individual team, especially as 5 doesn't really divide nicely by anything, just wasn't worth it, and I don't think anyone took that. Everyone worked in lockstep as far as I can make out with the divisional 5-week thing. So I know a lot of you were keen to hear about distributed development and what we've been doing there. So this is the sort of second half of the talk. So I work for this small team called Patterns and Practices. As I mentioned, our job is really to deliver guidance to enterprise customers to help them be more successful. It's a really small team, so it's actually part of the Visual Studio organization, but it's these 25 people squirreled away in a completely separate building as it happens. There's 25 full-time employees, and we typically have about the same number of contractors working on projects with us. And we also include subject matter experts. So lots of the time we're trying to get the community to help us build better guidance. We're not just trying to take whatever the product team gave us and just write guidance around that. We're actually trying to say to people in the community, hey, what did you do with this? And what made you successful doing it? And typically we're running between 3 and 5 Agile projects. And we're one of the sort of the earlier Agile shops at Microsoft, and we do something that's a bit like Scrum and XP. So yes, really distributed. So you've got Redmond up in the top corner there. That's typically where most of the Microsoft employees are sitting, although we do have at least one in the UK. We typically have dev teams based out of Argentina. So on any given day, you'll probably find my developers pairing with people in Argentina in the morning. And then typically we use an offshore test team who are based out of Mumbai, I think, in India, which gives us an entertaining set of time differences. And then on top of that, I mentioned we employ subject matter experts. And essentially, if you tell me you're the world's best subject matter expert on WPF and you want to come and work on our WPF project, but you live in Tibet, I guess you're living in Tibet and we're spending a lot of time on the phone, and maybe we'll fly you into town for a couple of weeks during the project at sort of strategic intervals. So we have a whole bunch of subject matter experts who, sometimes they're in the team room, sometimes they're not. And really they're not there. Sometimes they write code. Often they write some of the documentation with us. But they're not really there in a production capacity necessarily. They're really there because we want to know what they know. So, there's this challenge. You're trying to maintain these great teams. you're also trying to keep up your relationships with existing people. The reason we started off using some people in Argentina was because they happened to have a core expertise in something we were working on at the time, and we built on those relationships just like you build teams, right? I don't want to throw away a relationship I've got with a company that I built up over, nearly 5-7 years now, just because they're in Argentina. And obviously there's a certain element of controlling costs. Although I like to, I think just looking at, let's put it this way, just looking at the dollar hourly rate is not what I'm talking about there. That's a gross oversimplification. So we have this highly distributed development model. Typically if I go into a team room in the morning, there'll be 3 or 4 of the sort of full-time people on that team from Microsoft. They might be pairing with some of the people in Argentina. One of the representatives from the offshore testing company might have just arrived. They'll be looking at the results that came in overnight from India. We probably have a stand-up at 10 o'clock in the morning where we'll try and get the guys, at least the guys from the UK on the line if they're around. Obviously the Argentinians, we have a nice time overlap with them. But it's a pretty challenging model. And then every now and again, suddenly those team rooms that sort of look half empty. It's sort of a bit, you don't really, you think, oh, what's really going on in there? It seems half empty. And then every now and again, everyone will come into town and kind of steal desks from other rooms in order to find enough seats to put everyone on, which is always really cool to watch. So as I said, we're doing Scrum and XP with the teams split around the place. We've been doing this roughly about 5 years. It all started, we've had a sort of a series of people come through P&P. We've been lucky to have some people who were very experienced in Agile working within the group. Ward Cunningham worked there, Peter Provost, you may have heard of him, and Jim Newkirk, who's a very big name in the unit testing alias. He wrote a lot of, he wrote the part of N unit and is now working on X unit. So there've been a bunch of people there that were able to sort of mentor this and get us going, and now we're sort of one of the more prominent Agile groups within Microsoft. I spend quite a lot of time talking to other groups within Microsoft about what we do and how we do it. So again, Kent's question, how's it working out for you? Turns out we ship a lot of stuff. Most of these ship on Codeplex. We ship the source to them. We ship them every couple of weeks so people can download the latest bits. We're looking for feedback on it. That's one of the big reasons that we were really keen on the Agile approach, because we really are trying to drop stuff to customers every couple of weeks and get feedback from the community. So we try and work with them on that. Most of these are relatively small. I think the biggest thing we produce is probably this thing called Enterprise Library, which is a sort of a framework of cross-cutting concerns for people producing large .NET apps. So, logging, caching, security, all these sort of things that developers would typically have to go and either find or write their own framework for. That's about 250,000 lines of code now. And it's in its... It says 5.0, but we've had a couple of sort of point releases in there as well. So it's in its sort of sixth plus release. I think it's fair to say that our customers are generally pretty positive about the things that we produce. And I think that's largely because of the way we work with them, in that they feel involved. It wasn't just something we gave them and told them to get on with. We actually try and involve people from within the community. So much of what I'm going to say here actually applies to all Agile teams. So you might sit there going, well, duh. It turns out that just being distributed makes the impact of these things much, much more, and therefore getting it wrong just involves an awful lot more pain. We're going to cover these sort of in detail. But these are all things that if you've hung out with Agile people, they talk about a lot. Communication, focusing on teams, that sort of thing. And really, I want to just go through some of these. There's actually a white paper you can download. I'll give you the URL of where you can get it from at the end. I actually wrote all this up. It's a sort of here's how we do it at Patterns and Practices. Your mileage may vary. sort of white paper. But you can download that. So there's a whole bunch more sort of stuff in there with some specifics. So really the thing to notice here is, Agile spends a whole lot of its time trying to make communication easier and throws a bunch of stuff that you might have done in a sort of more traditional approach away, right? So, you put everyone in the same room, and that sort of gets you off the hook, you hope, from writing a big formal spec. Because if I have a question about something, I can just go ask the product owner or ask the developer who wrote it. I don't need to go look at a big design document or a specification. The problem with that is that you just distributed everyone, and it's much harder for them to have those conversations. I remember years and years ago working on a project, and I was based out of Reading in the UK, and most of the people I was working with were based in either Syracuse or Austin, Texas. And people would constantly talk about the thingy and the widget. It was probably something on a whiteboard, but I never got to see it. They could have been building real thingies and widgets for all I care. It's really easy for all that stuff to get lost. One of the things that we discovered when we were doing some of these projects at Patterns and Practices is that especially in those early design phases, it's much, much harder when you're on the phone. And I'll come to this in a minute when we talk about when we actually try and get people traveling and in town. But really, you've got to try and do everything you can to maximize that communication bandwidth, basically put back the things you lost. I spent some time, there was a workshop at Agile 2008 on distributed teams, and it was really interesting because if you closed your eyes in that workshop and sort of redacted the word distributed and just thought about it as people talking about their teams, they just sounded dysfunctional. Right, be like, well, Fred always gets in at like 2 in the afternoon, and he'll never take a meeting with me, and he only answers email. It's just like, what's up with Fred? Well, Fred's in India. Actually, Fred gets up at 6 in the morning to be in work to be able to stand up for you, but it doesn't feel like that to me. Fred just seems like he's not really playing the game. So there's a whole bunch of things that you have to do to try and put that stuff back. Around you can't write one-line sort of placeholders for your user stories, for instance. So nothing beats face-to-face. As I mentioned, at the beginning of these projects, we tend to try and get everyone in town for those large upfront design meetings. I've heard other companies that do this. Any of you heard of BMC Software? They've done some really interesting sort of papers. If you look at the last couple of Agile conferences, they've done some really cool papers on how they do this. They have a sort of a medium-sized team, i.e. bigger than this one, but not as big as Visual Studio. It was of the order of hundreds and hundreds of people, distributed basically all the way from the East Coast of the US to Israel, I think. And they would do the same thing, get everyone in the same room for the first 3 or 4 weeks at the beginning of the project, and try and get all those thingy and the widget conversations out of the way when everyone can actually see the same whiteboard. That makes your life a lot easier. We also tend to bring people in at other key points. So, we're releasing every couple of weeks, but we might do sort of more major releases. We might do a more formal beta release, for instance, try and get people in town around those types of things. And it's not just about everyone coming into town and working really hard. I don't know whether you guys travel, but when I travel for work, it's kind of like, well, what else are you going to do? You get up, you go to work, you work really hard. You go back to the hotel room, and you're like, well, what do I do? Oh, I'll work really hard. Maybe you don't do that. Maybe that's just me. So, we try and organize some social events for the people coming into town because it's important to try and get people to sort of know each other, because then you don't get that them and us thing, which you inevitably get over the phone. And it's really funny, if you ever go talk to the people who are the them, they're not the them, you are, right? Go talk to your offshore guys in India, and they'll just go, yeah, those idiots in Redmond, they don't know what they're talking about. But it's important to not just work really hard, but to do some, we tend to do cool, I think people have done whirly ball, they've done rock band parties, they've just gone out for meals and hung out. It's important to realize the guy on the other end of the phone who's now working late because of the time difference, isn't actually being willfully stupid. They're a real person too. And the same goes the other way around. So we tend to do some social events during that time as well, and get people into town periodically. Try and get them in the town at the end of the project so they can focus on getting stuff out the door. We have some interesting requirements at the end of the project, which means we kind of have to have an end game, largely because we focus very heavily on documentation. So there's a sort of a linear period of the project at the end where you're sort of done with the product, but you still have to round out the documentation. We tend to get people in town for that, and also the all-important ship party at the end of the product. We want it to be a fun place to work, right? A lot of the people we have from out of town are contractors, but we actually have them back on multiple projects, and we want to keep it that way. So it turns out that time zones are actually far, far worse than distance, right? The guys in Argentina are a long way away. Remember that map of the Earth is all bent out of shape to make essentially Western Europe look really big, even though it's not. So actually, Argentina's a really long way away, but it's only a 4-hour time difference, which is way, way, way more workable than working with someone in Europe, just because you're basically out by a whole day at that point. So that's why we've tried to work really closely with several companies in Argentina that have relationships with us now. And then the other thing so that's temporal asymmetry. You also have sort of spatial asymmetry. The worst case of that is where you have one individual who's off on his own, right? I don't know whether I worked in a remote office like that for a while, and for a start, that guy gets forgotten all the time. I did this to someone on a project we were running. We had everyone in town for one of these meetings. Everyone was there except Oscar. Oscar couldn't make it because he was finishing his master's degree or something. He had a good reason for not being there. And he just got forgotten all the time, and I would feel really bad about it. But he would sort of, he would call into stand-up in the morning and would just be blah, 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 talking about something, and he'd be like, hang on, what design change? And we'll be, oh yeah, sorry, Oscar, that was that thing we decided yesterday and no one remembered to call you. And one of the things that I sort of encourage is, firstly, not having that distribution, and secondly, if you're going to, we came up with this notion of the team buddy, right? It's this idea that, if you're going to have someone who's stuck off on their own like that, you better have someone in the room whose kind of job it is to remind you that, hey, we should call Oscar, or someone should email Oscar and tell him if Oscar's actually not, around, because it's the evening for him. So we try and avoid localizing single people on their own. Ideally, we try and group people together so they've got other people to bounce ideas off. There's a whole bunch of practices in this white paper, but the three big ones are this idea of the team buddy, this idea of trying to group people together, and then the other thing that we do for places where the time zone is really big, the way that the test team works is they have this guy who's the sort of in-room representative. Because the time difference is so huge, it's 13 hours, and we only have testers in India. We don't have developers, so they can't sort of form their own compartmentalized team, which would be hard on the products we do because they're relatively small. What we typically do is we have this one or maybe two guys who are on the team in Redmond who magically appear to get the work of 5 people done overnight. It's kind of cool, and really their job is to sort of coordinate and represent that. It's not an easy job. Typically, people like Manny and the other people we have who do that come in late and work late because they need that overlap. But that tends to be how we handle that. So at least there's some sort of connectivity there. And the other important thing is that the guys who do that job have worked with the people in India. So it's not just me or some other random idiot they've never met who's calling them up. It's actually typically what happens is that the vendor we use cycles people, periodically in and out of Redmond. So it's someone they know and they've been and they've talked to, and they know that when he says that the people in Redmond have some completely crazy idea, but trust me, it's going to work out. They trust him and it's going to work out, as opposed to flipping the bit. Has anyone here heard of Conway's law? So yeah, a couple of people. So Conway's law is kind of interesting. What Conway's law really says is that if you have an organization that's basically broken up into 3 distinct groups and you say to them, produce an application, you'll end up with a 3-tier application, because typically they'll break the problem down as a set of components with interfaces between them. This is Melvin Conway said this a long, long time ago, and there's sort of a fair amount of evidence. You can see this in all sorts of large software projects. The problem with that is that users don't care about this. And my users don't care about it doubly because I ship the source code to them. So with a shrink-wrap software product, say, or a big website, you could sort of paper over the cracks, right? No one would have to really know how you've done this. Well, it's doubly hard for us to do that because we're actually going to ship them the source code and they're going to look at it and we're telling them that it's best guidance on how to use the Microsoft platform. And they're going to be, oh, so you created this component over here and it seems completely sort of, isolated from everything else. Is that a best practice? Well, the answer, no. The guys in Argentina wrote it, and that's, we just let them get on with it, and that was it. That's not a good answer, right? So we spent quite a lot of time trying to make sure that these sub-teams and people we have in different places don't focus on subcomponents, right? So we don't end up with a team in Buenos Aires that are the only people that know about, the data access component, or one guy in Costa Rica who's the only guru we have on something else. There are 2 reasons for that. Firstly, I want my architecture to reflect my user stories, not my organization's distribution. And the second one is, if one of those people or organization goes away, I don't want to suddenly discover that no one on my team knows about this. So obviously, we actually try and pair over the phone. One of the things that you also get out of cycling people in and out is you start to get that overlap. But what we also do is we try and make sure that we don't have a particular group of people in a particular place focused on a component. We want to have the whole team or some section of the team focused on a story, because that's what users care about. They care about stories, not how your architecture looks. It comes back to that, let's give them the design doc because the product doesn't work, it doesn't fly. And then we try and remove that specialization when people visit. So there's quite a lot of work there that goes on. Because we can't necessarily have everybody looking at all the code, because we can't pair all the time, we tend to have to compensate and make up for that. So it's not unusual if you go into an end of iteration review on one of the teams we have to find people sitting there collectively looking at a piece of code that was written during that key. Or if they can't pair program on stuff, you'll send around change sets and have other people review it before it's checked in. Because obviously you can't pair program all the time because not everyone is necessarily in the office all the time, especially if you want to try and pair program across time zones. So we spoke about this a little bit when we talked about the how we did things in Visual Studio. But essentially teams don't come for free. A friend of mine is basically a professional Scrum coach. He sort of said, well, it takes me 3 months to typically see a team form, probably double that if you're distributed. Well, our projects only last 6 months, so we're kind of done at that point. So we try and keep teams together between projects, which is challenging because some of the contractors, so they'll want to go off and find another gig. But if you look at some of the people we have who run projects for us, who've been most successful with their projects, that is one of the things they're most maniacal about, is trying to basically game things so they can keep people between projects and so that they can have a sort of a core group of people that's basically worked together before. You might have some new people and some people roll off, but basically there's a sort of a core group of people that understand what they're doing and how each other works. And where you see that work less well is where you suddenly throw a whole bunch of new people together and expect them to get on with it when really they've only had a couple of weeks in the same room with each other, if that. Especially if you've got language differences and cultural differences taking place. Not everyone, for instance, approaches conflict resolution and problem solving in the same way, which, given me, is probably a good thing. And then we try and provide some training to ramp up new people. So, we have a wiki, there are some books I recommend. They're nothing spectacular. There's Kent's XP book, there's Ken Schwaber's Scrum book. Although now most of the vendors, the contractors we use, typically kind of get the way we work. So there's actually less of that. They're not going to send us people who don't really sort of understand the agile sort of approach that we use. We don't get devs in the door now who don't really want to write unit tests. They understand that's the sort of thing that they're going to be expected to do here. But that's something that's basically evolved over about 5 years. And then we keep sort of evolving the process with retrospectives, just like you would expect. The reason I mention that is because, well, that's another, well, why wouldn't you do that? Well, that's sort of something that's quite hard to do over a phone line. We typically sort of have an anonymous sticky note session with Notepad. I'll come to that when I talk a little bit about tools. So tools. So just to be clear, most of these are Microsoft tools. The reason they're Microsoft tools is because that's the ones that we use. But in almost all cases, there are other tools. You don't have to use Microsoft's Instant Messenger. There are other Java-based things you can use, for instance. There's a whole bunch of different project management tools you can use. We were using TFS with an add-on for it called Scrum for Team System, which, for instance, let you do essentially story, the sticky note cards interactively. So typically the way we run meetings is through live meeting, which allows us to show things on a projector in the team room and have everyone else dial in. And you can do iteration planning interactively like that, for instance. But the whole agile thing of we essentially value tools less than we value some other things. I'm a total subscriber to that. I would say that tools are a third order effect. If your people are not right, then you're really in trouble. If they're following a process that's messed up, then you're really in trouble. And tools are kind of that last order bit. I think where the difference comes in is when you've got either a really large team or a really distributed team, you're going to need some tooling. You can't really do everything with sticky notes. You're going to need some project management reporting. Not really popular words, but you're going to need some of that if you're going to keep the whole thing on track. So these are the tools we've been using. We've been experimenting with some other things like having live webcams running in the rooms. It was actually interesting. When I wrote the white paper on this, I said to people, everyone I sent the draft to said, well, what about webcams? And I said, yeah, why isn't that in there? And I went and talked to the people I had on different projects, and they said, well, at the time, they just didn't work to Buenos Aires. There wasn't the bandwidth available. And in the last sort of year, that seems to have changed, and people are now using them. But that actually comes to an important point in that bandwidth is effectively a tool, right? If you don't have sufficient bandwidth, you're going to kind of struggle. You're going to struggle with, replicating your source trees potentially. You're going to struggle with setting up meetings, running things like webcams. All that sort of stuff just becomes that much harder. So that's when people talk to me about doing this sort of thing, that's one of the first questions I kind of ask them is, where are your people distributed and what sort of bandwidth have they got? So I'm going to spend I just want to run through some of the sort of common themes, because I think what struck me after I gave this talk a couple of times, and I talked to a bunch of people in senior management within Visual Studio, there were sort of these common themes that came out across both these things. And it really boils down to the fact that in some cases, if you've got a really large team, it's distributed, right? Because it's not all in the same place. And in fact, one of the anti-patterns around distributed teams is thinking you're co-located, but actually you're distributed because you're not in the same room or on the same corridor. People say, oh, my team's co-located, it's in the same building. Well, the building's got 6 floors, and I haven't seen the guys on floor 1 for 3 weeks. I mean, they might as well be in India at that point. But you're not behaving like they're distributed. You're trying to play the we're all in the same place game, and yet actually you're not. So you're worse off because you don't know that you're worse off. So there are these common themes, and I just want to sort of step through them. this whole one of the fastest ways to get me to sort of get mad is to say, oh, you're not doing Agile if you're not doing practice X, right? So you're not doing Agile if you're not writing unit tests for all your code, or you're not pair programming. And really it's about the principles behind it, especially when you start to do these challenging things around really large teams or really distributed teams. You know, it's what are you trying to get out of this? You know, a good example of that is story cards, right? You know, well, are you doing Agile if you're not using story cards? Well, a story card is really a placeholder for a conversation, right? It doesn't really have a lot written on it. It says, you know, we're going to implement this, and it's got a couple of lines on it. What really that's saying is someone's going to take that story card and have a conversation around it. Well, if you're so large or so distributed that you can't have the conversation, how are you going to get back that principle of communicating around the work that needs to be done? And maybe that means you have to write a little mini spec, because otherwise someone in Argentina is going to take the card first thing in their morning, and I've done this on many occasions, had that awkward conversation at stand-up where they say they worked really hard on something for 4 hours, and then you have to kind of have a conversation with them around how it's not quite what you wrote on the card. And it's not their fault. They couldn't talk to you. You weren't there, right? So you really have to sort of think about the whys and think about the principles, and then adapt the practices to the situation. And that's something that's challenging. I think it's even more challenging in a really large team. We've talked about communication a whole load. I mean, it really is one of the core things when it comes to running Agile teams, and in both these cases, it's the thing that you really, really have lost or will struggle with. The Visual Studio team was actually geographically distributed too. There are bits in Carolina, there are bits in India, but it also occupies 2 or 3 buildings in different parts of the campus at Microsoft. So actually, if you were in building 25, that's a 10-minute walk to go talk to your colleagues in building 40 or 41. They moved us to 25 for a year, and it was not a fun experience, right? You really are distributed then. This is an interesting quote by Ken Schwabe. You know, quality isn't really negotiable, and it turns out that you really have to redouble your focus on that when you're distributed or you get really large, because the penalties for having your quality drop are just so much worse, right? You know, you have these huge bug backlogs that you have to go deal with, or you're trying to solve complex issues across time zones, and it would have been and geographical distance, and it would have been far better off if the person who wrote the defect was able to fix it really quickly, not come back to it, and you end up chasing your own tail. I didn't mention CI when I talked about distributed teams, but the Patterns and Practices team is pretty maniacal about CI and building other sort of technologies in, not just build and running unit tests, static analysis, code coverage, all sorts of good stuff there. And really what that does is it gives you a linchpin around which you can hang a team and quality regardless of time zones, right? You know, the CI server's always there. If I check some stuff in Argentina at 8 o'clock in the morning, the CI server should notice if you've got good coverage. So we spoke a bit about Conway's law, and you know, the fact that what your users want shouldn't be affected by the way your product is structured. That becomes really challenging on a large team like Visual Studio, simply because you've got to have some structure, right? You can't just say, well, we'll all work on an end-to-end story. I can't have everybody checking in code to the CLR potentially. The CLR is the Microsoft jargon for the Common Language Runtime, which is the runtime upon which all .NET code works. Needless to say, it's quite a complicated thing. You know, I'm a .NET developer. I write all that code. Should I be allowed to go crazy on the CLR code base? Probably not. Again, I mentioned CI. I mentioned the struggles that the division had with building frequently when you've got a really large code base. But building and integrating frequently is the way to get visibility into what's going on and to keep the quality high, right? So that's, you know, all the Patterns and Practices teams use CI for distributed development. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're we're pretty successful with doing that. It doesn't take long to track things down, and we don't have people running around at the end of the project with high bug counts. Typically, we're able to be pretty aggressive, and that also allows us to ship every couple of weeks. And I think the last thing is building teams. I'm a developer. I'm not a soft skills sort of project management coach type person really, but I think there's a huge value in recognizing that's something that needs to be done in both these environments. And it's really easy. One of the things that, for instance, we noticed was that we didn't exactly fall off the bandwagon in patterns and practices, but it's a challenging environment when you're distributed, and if you're not careful, you can use that as an excuse to skip things. We're distributed. It's going to be really hard to have a retrospective at the end of this iteration because a couple of people are out. The team's in multiple time zones, what have you. It's a holiday in Argentina, right? They have, funnily enough, they don't get 4th of July. They get a whole bunch of other different days for things that they want to celebrate. But that can really mess with your schedule, right? You come in on a Monday morning and it's like, where the hell is everyone? Well, they're on their holiday, right? So it's really easy to sort of drop off, fall off the wagon with some of these things. And one of the things we didn't really have was someone who was dedicated as I could walk into a team room and say, well, who's the coach for this team? And so we sort of renewed our commitment to that, and that's made a noticeable difference in terms of how many retrospectives people actually run, because there's someone there saying, no, we really should do this. This is important. It may only take half an hour, but we're actually going to do it. Whereas, when you're distributed like that, it's just another reason to, be human and potentially take an easier option. And that's pretty much all I had. There's a link there to my blog. If you go to the papers section, there's a link to the white paper I wrote on distributed agile at patterns and practices. There's also a link to a slide deck and a paper I wrote for Agile a couple of years ago on the really large project we did in Visual Studio. It was called Agile and the Inconceivably Large. I'm also going to put up a link to some other decks. There'll actually be a blog post on my site later tonight with some of the things I talked about here. And if people ask questions that require follow-up, I'll update that, and it'll be up there too, probably first thing tomorrow morning. So with that, any questions, basically? Yeah, so the question was, if you have a really radically distributed team, or you have different development shops in different parts of the world, maybe you're doing a follow the sun approach, how do you deal with that? You can't really fly everyone everywhere all the time. That's not actually something we've had to address, simply because of the way we've developed our approach. Agile 2009 this year, there was a really interesting talk about using it wasn't Second Life, but it was another one of those tools. They were an insurance company. When I put together that blog post, I will attempt to include a link to that paper. It was actually really interesting. There's a couple of people now who, Second Life is, well, it's Second Life, right? There are actually these companies now that are producing essentially virtual environments that you can go to work in, as opposed to virtual environments that you can have your Second Life in. And they basically produce meeting rooms. You can have a virtual reality meeting room, and it has sticky notes on the wall. It was actually a pretty cool demo. I'll see if I can find a link to that and put it in the notes. Yeah, the question is, do I have any data in terms of which types of approach were taken within a feature crew were more successful? The answer is no, I don't. I think that would actually be a really hard thing to do, simply because one of the reasons, let's be clear, one of the reasons that the division let people do that is because they have vastly different requirements, right? So me trying to measure the productivity or happiness or anything like that of people who were building bits of the CLR over people who were building, I don't know, bits of Visual Basic, or bits of the tooling around testing, the test tools that we ship. They're just really, really different types of product. It would be a bit like trying to compare the productivity of the happiness or any metric of the people who write the Linux kernel over someone who's writing, I don't know, the PHP compiler or WordPress, right? They're just very, very different things. I don't believe we have any data on that. So were we forcing teams to do Agile by making them do burn down charts? And the answer is no. At our product unit level, we basically said all the teams in the product unit are going to take this approach. So in some ways, yes, that was mandated from above. At the product unit level, they were expected to report their overall process on their, on how's Visual Studio Tools for Office going. And that was essentially, that was mandated by the division. It was like, look, you've got to fill in this report that says, here's where I am, here are the features that I'm, running at the moment, here's how far I think I am through them, here's what's at risk, here's what's not. That was some of those sort of reports I showed you. So at some level, you kind of, just from a purely practical perspective above everything else, if I'm just for me as a manager trying to track half a dozen Scrum teams, if they're all reporting things in different ways, I just can't get my head around it, right? Even if they said, well, I'm going to use story points and I'm going to use ideal hours, right? I have to sit in a meeting with these guys, and one minute I'm trying to think in story points, the next minute I'm trying to think in ideal hours. By the end of it, my head spins. I'm not trying to compare one team's ideal hours with another team's ideal hours, because that would be bad. But I need sort of a common language so that I can, I know which way is up. And the same goes at the divisional level, right? Someone like Soma, who runs the division, doesn't want to be sort of thinking all the time, well, this team reports like this team reports like that. So in some ways you have to come up with a common language for how you report things, just because otherwise it becomes very, very difficult for management to make intelligent decisions about what's going on. But just to be clear, one thing we did not do was try and compare the performance of teams. If you told me you were doing 100 ideal hours in the next iteration, and the next team came in and told me they were doing 50, I wouldn't be kind of going, hey, his team was doing twice as much as you. What's up with that? Right, so the question was, how do we deal with culture when we're managing these distributed teams from different... Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. I mean, yes, clearly it is important, and I didn't really cover that. I think largely because it's not something I claim to be an expert in. But it's not just a cultural thing, it's also a role thing. So I think the thing I noticed more than culture was the fact that you've got a bunch of people on your team who you've effectively got a whole bunch of full-time employees, and then you've got a whole bunch of people who are there on a contract, right? And they're probably from a different culture. And the way they maybe the way they approach, sorry, I'm trying to sort of get this straight in my head. Yeah, it is a tough question. Their level of investment in the project is different for starters, right? Some of these people are hired guns effectively. And one of the ways that I sort of like to think about great people I have on the project who are on a contract is when I can't tell there's any difference. They'll turn up in a meeting and a couple of the Microsoft employees will say, oh, we should do X, Y, and Z, and one of the contractors will turn around and go, that's stupid, right? Rather than saying, well, I'm earning my, $100 an hour or whatever it is. You can do what you want, and you'll have to pay me for another 100 hours in order to clear up the mess that you're inevitably going to make. That is an attitude, right? I'm not saying it's a good one, but it is an attitude. Well, I'll just do what you say. So I think the thing I noticed as the high order bit was that the difference there in terms of level of investment. There's definitely a difference in the way different cultures deal with managing not necessarily conflict, but sort of high-risk discussions. And I think one of the things that people in the US, and I mean I'm the same because I'm your typical abrasive Brit, We tend to say exactly what we think, and we think that's okay, right? And lots of other cultures don't try and grab the problem by the throat like that. They'll skirt around the issue. I know I've spoken to people who are American and do business in China, for instance, and there's a whole, list of sort of things you have to be aware of working in some of the cultures from the Far East like that. And that's all exacerbated by trying to do this over the phone, right? You can't see that the guy's sort of basically saying no when he just said yes. Or, she says everything's fine when in fact things are clearly not fine because, I don't know, things are being thrown across the room in the background or the phone's on mute because they're all laughing. Well, no, I know people do this, right? They put the phone on mute and you're like, are you still there? And it's like, no, because they're busy. They've just blown the schedule, nothing's going to work, it's all horrible, they're morons. And then they unmute and they say, oh, that's fine, Ade. Right? So it becomes much, much more difficult. But I think the high order bit for me was the difference between level of vestiture in terms of being a full-time employee or a contractor. And that was something that, I really aggressively look for when I'm looking for vendors, contractors to be on the project. That's pretty much the first thing I say to them is I want you to be a fully vested member of the team. I'm not going to ding you. Because sometimes they're worried about, I was that awkward contractor who asked all those awkward questions. No one's going to want me on the next version of the project. Actually, I do want you on the next, within reason, obviously, but I do want you on the next version of the project. And that's another good reason for getting people into town and trying to get some face time and some hanging out time with them to try and sort of gauge the sort of, their personality and essentially try and get rid of some of those stereotypes, right? Because, I mentioned a couple of stereotypes that I've heard of about people dealing, East and West. But equally, I've met people that completely don't meet any of those stereotypes, right? And until you've actually hung out with them, you won't know that. Does that sort of answer your question? I don't really claim to be an expert on that, but it is definitely an issue. Yes. So the question really was, are there any non-Microsoft tools that you use? So for developers. So essentially, bearing in mind, one of our core missions is to help Microsoft developers be more successful with our platform. Typically, yes, we use Microsoft tools. I think the notable exceptions are we have some additions to Visual Studio that we use. So almost all the developers, in fact, all my developers use ReSharper, for instance. ReSharper's an awesome tool if you want to essentially make code plastic and be able to change it. It has some fantastic features in it. We do unit testing with test-driven.net, which is another plugin that makes doing test-driven development a much better experience on Visual Studio. Quite a lot of our teams use Cruise Control. There's a .NET version of Cruise Control. We use that. We've also experimented with Team Build. It depends a little bit on the project. Cruise Control is a very lightweight system. It has some advantages on some of the projects we've been doing. On others, like the SharePoint project, we've used Team Build. That's about it. We've used some open source frameworks too, like jQuery, for instance, is something we're using in our ASP.NET web development guidance. So really the question is, you've enabled all these people who are distributed, not by choice, to be more involved in the team. Do you then discover that all the people that are kind of supposedly co-located in your local office suddenly decide, well, I might as well go work from home or the beach house or all this sort of stuff? I haven't actually seen that. Interestingly, there's a sort of another way of looking at that, and I've heard of people doing this. There was someone who provided feedback on the white paper was very sort of keen on this idea, which is that actually you really want a team that's either completely distributed or completely co-located, because that's this idea of asymmetry, right? And that's where some people miss out on the hallway conversations and others don't. And he used to have a team that was completely distributed. So it didn't even matter. He was working at a startup, so they were all working out of their houses. But it wouldn't even matter if two people were actually in the same place. They would still try and get on a con call before they talk to everybody else, right? Just to basically remove that asymmetry. But I haven't had that problem. The people on the teams in Redmond, they have pretty flexible work schedules. Some days people aren't in, some days they are. But by and large, they're in the team room. Certainly when it comes to the developers, one of the things I hire for is we have a team room. You're basically one of the people who's absolutely key to driving the activity that goes on with that room. Ergo, the best way to do that is pretty much religiously sit in it. And if you're not, the other thing is if you're not in the room, I think certainly on the teams I've worked on, and I think I wrote a blog post about this a while back, it was basically if you're not in the team room, you're not on the team. Which is really, if you don't show up, everything's just going to carry on without you. In the past, we've had problems with people being split across multiple teams, right? So they play the seagull game. Right, which is, they come in, they make a big fuss, they make a, let's just say, mess, and then they leave, right? And the team sort of picks up the pieces and continues on, and then they repeat this behavior later because they're going off, they're doing something else, and then they're coming back. What happens in the meantime is the team continues going, it makes decisions, it carries on, and then they're basically upset when they come back that, well, you did all this stuff without me. Well, my response to that is, well, you weren't there. Essentially tough. So typically we've not had that problem, but I can see you might have issues there if you let people do that. I think that's pretty much all I have time for.